180 civilians injured, residential blocks sheared in half, and a nuclear reactor just 10 kilometers away from total catastrophe. But the headline tonight isn't the damage, it's the failure. For 35 days, the world was told the shield was impenetrable. Tonight, the interceptors launched, the world watched, and for the first time in this conflict, nobody stopped them. This is the moment the iron broke. Iranian ballistic missiles just reached the city closest to Israel's most sensitive strategic asset, and the defense system described as 92% effective simply missed. 180 people in the hospital, buildings collapsed, and a 10-kilometer buffer zone that held only by pure luck. This is the story of the night. The assumption of safety died, and why the new phase of this battle changes everything from this morning forward. Stay with me, because what 180 injured people and 0 interceptions means for the world is a story that requires to be told. Dawado, people. Iran just injured 180 people in the city next to Israel's nuclear reactor. Not soldiers, not military personnel, at a base adjacent to the facility. Civilians in a city and residential buildings whose facades were sheared off by ballistic missiles with warheads weighing hundreds of kilograms. In apartments where people had exercised balls and bags of dog food, and the specific accumulated evidence of ordinary life that a ballistic missile produces as debris when it arrives at a residential neighborhood. 180 people injured in the city that sits 10 kilometers from the Shimon Peres Negative Nuclear Research Center, and nobody intercepted it. That last sentence is the sentence that makes this strike different from every other strike in 35 days of this conflict. Not the 180 injured, as terrible as 180 injured in a single strike is. This conflict has been producing injuries across 35 days of missile attacks. Not the residential buildings destroyed. Residential buildings have been struck repeatedly throughout this conflict. Nobody intercepted it. The Israeli Air Force, the air defense system that has been described as intercepting 92% of incoming Iranian projectiles across 35 days and 65-plus named waves, launched interceptors at the missiles heading for Dimona. The interceptors went up, the missiles came down, the interceptors missed, the missiles hit. 180 people injured, buildings destroyed, and the nuclear research center 10 kilometers from the impact sites is intact. Not because the defense worked, but because the missiles hit the city and not the center by 10 kilometers without being intercepted. Stay with me, because what Iran injuring 180 people in the city next to Israel's nuclear reactor without a single successful interception means what the specific failure of engagement rather than coverage tells you about what Iranian ballistic missiles have achieved on day 35. What 180 injured civilians in the shadow of a nuclear research center communicates to the world that has been watching this conflict build toward exactly this moment, and what nobody intercepted it means when it describes the airspace above the city, closest to Israel's most sensitive strategic asset, is the story that 180 people and 0 interceptions and 10 kilometers require to be told. 180 injured, nobody intercepted it. 10 kilometer, let's start with the 180 people. Because the number requires disaggregation into the human reality, it contains before any strategic analysis is possible. 116 people were injured in aid, 7 seriously. The rest ranging from moderate blast injuries to the specific category of injury that Israeli emergency services classify as light. Lacerations from shattered glass, bruising from the pressure wave, the physical consequences of being in proximity to a warhead detonation in an urban environment. Ared is a city of approximately 25,000 people in the Nikvi Desert, approximately 35 kilometers from the nuclear research center. Its city center took a direct hit. 64 people were injured in Dimona, 1 seriously, the rest across the same spectrum of blast-adjacent injury. Dimona is the city of 40,000 people that sits directly adjacent to the nuclear research center, 10 kilometers from the facility that Israel has never officially confirmed, and that every intelligence assessment describes as housing Israel's nuclear arsenal. Its residential neighborhoods took a direct hit. The seriously injured are in hospitals. The hospitals that are running on generator power after the Urit Rabin strike. The hospitals that are managing water supply on reserve after the desalination strikes. The hospitals that have been treating missile casualties for 35 days are treating the 180 from Dimona and Ohrid tonight with the specific medical infrastructure of a country whose support systems have been systematically degraded across 35 days of this conflict. One person in serious condition in Dimona, in the city next to the nuclear reactor, because nobody intercepted the missile that put them there. Let's talk about what nobody intercepted. It actually means technically, because the phrase covers a specific operational reality that requires unpacking to be understood. The IDF confirmed that interceptors were launched against both missiles, against the Dimona missile, against the AAD missile. The engagement sequence activated. The system saw the incoming threats. It launched countermeasures. The interceptors flew toward the incoming warheads and failed to destroy them. This is the distinction that changes everything about what tonight means. A coverage failure, the failure mode that has been producing impacts across Tel Aviv and the northern front, occurs when no interceptor is launched because the depleted inventory and the three-front demand leave certain threats without coverage. The system does not engage because there's nothing left to engage with. An engagement failure occurs when the system engages and the engagement does not succeed. The interceptors are there. They launch. They miss. The warhead continues to the target. Engagement failure at Dimona means the missiles that hit the city next to Israel's nuclear reactor were not defeated by the interception attempt. They were engaged and they survived the engagement. The Israeli Air Force said the failure was not systemic, that the circumstances in each case were different, that the two failures happening in the same area within 2 hours was coincidental. Two non-cystic coincidental failures in the most heavily protected airspace in Israel on the same night against the city closest to the nuclear program. The investigation that the IDF ordered will determine what the non-cystic explanation is. The 180 injured are the cost of the investigation happening after the fact. Let's talk about the woman who said, "We thought we were safe." Her name is Galit Amir. She is 50 years old. She works as a care provider. She lives in Dimona. She has lived in Dimona, knowing that the Nuclear Research Center is nearby. And for her entire life in that city, the presence of the nuclear facility has meant not fear, but safety. The logic was straightforward, and it was correct as logic. If any location in Israel was going to have maximum air defense coverage, it was the location closest to the program, whose protection was the highest priority of Israeli strategic security. The nuclear facility made Dimona safe. That was the inference. That was the rational conclusion from the observable fact that Israel would protect the space above its nuclear program with everything available. Iran hit Dimona. Nobody intercepted it. Galit Amir said, "We thought we were safe." She was not wrong to think so. She was applying correct reasoning to the observable facts of her situation. The nuclear facility nearby, the air defense that must protect it, the safety that follows from both. The interceptors launched. They missed. The inference was correct. The assumption beneath it was not. The assumption was that launching interceptors produces successful interception. Tonight, it did not. Let's talk about the specific physical evidence of what happens when a ballistic missile with a warhead weighing hundreds of kilograms hits a residential neighborhood in a desert city without being intercepted. The facade of several adjacent apartment blocks sheared off. The specific structural consequence of a warhead detonation adjacent to or within a building, the pressure wave expanding outward through the structural envelope, the exterior wall receiving the blast load and separating from the structure, the interior of the apartment suddenly exposed to the desert night, furniture visible from the street. The evidence of meals and routines and ordinary life suddenly opened to the Negev air, glass shattered for blocks around the impact point. Every window in the radius of the blast wave broken simultaneously. The specific auditory experience of that moment, the boom that David, a 39-year-old Dimona resident, described as something we haven't heard before, followed by the cascade of every window in the neighborhood breaking in the seconds after the initial detonation. A 3-story building in Dimona collapsed. Not damaged, collapsed. The structural failure that a direct hit or a near miss of sufficient weight produces in a building that was not designed to absorb the specific load of a warhead detonation in its immediate vicinity. Multiple fires breaking out across the impact sites. the secondary ignition that explosive detonations produce in the residential environments, where gas lines and electrical infrastructure and combustible materials are present throughout the building stock. Anna Valen's supermarket was destroyed. She described leaving the bomb shelter room and finding everything destroyed, the specific commercial life of a small desert city, the supermarket that serves 40,000 people, reduced to debris by a missile that nobody intercepted. This is what 180 injured and nobody intercepted it looks like from the street level of Dimona. Let's talk about what happened in the 90 seconds before the missiles hit. Because the civil defense experience of 180 people in the city next to the nuclear reactor is the specific human experience of the warning system working perfectly. While the interception system failed completely, the home-run command sirens activated. The alerts went to phones. The 90-second window that Israeli civil defense provides between alert and impact opened. People moved. They went to their mad rooms, the reinforced security rooms that Israeli building code requires in every residential unit. They closed the blast doors. They waited. The sirens worked. The alerts worked. The 90 seconds produced the movement that produced 180 injured rather than 180 dead. Netanyahu said no one was killed due to luck. The luck he was describing as the luck of the Muhammad. The luck that the buildings that were hit had reinforced security rooms that absorbed enough of the blast to keep the occupants alive. The luck that the impact geometry was adjacent to rather than direct on the specific units where people were sheltering. The civil defense worked. The shelter compliance worked. Nobody died because the warning system gave people 90 seconds and the MADs absorbed the blast. Nobody intercepted it because the interception system launched and missed. Both are true simultaneously. The system that kept people alive worked. The system that was supposed to prevent people from needing it did not. Let's talk about the Nuclear Research Center, the 10 kilometers, the specific geography that makes tonight the most consequential single night of this conflict. The Shimon Peres NGV Nuclear Research Center sits in the desert southeast of Dimona. Its heavy water reactor has been operational since the late 1950s. Its underground infrastructure, the specific facilities that intelligence assessments describe as the plutonium reprocessing capacity that produced Israel's nuclear material, extends beneath the desert in ways that surface imagery cannot fully document. The missiles hit Dimona, not the center, the city, 10 kilometers from the facility. 10 kilometers is not a miss. It is the difference between the target the Iranians said they were aiming at and the residential neighborhoods where the missiles actually landed. Iranian state media said the strikes targeted the Shimon Peres Nega Nuclear Research Center. The missiles hit Dimona. The IDF said the nuclear facility was not damaged, but the IAA issued a statement. Rafael G. urged maximum military restraint in the vicinity of nuclear facilities. The IAEA issued statements about nuclear safety. It issued a statement tonight because Iranian missiles hit a city in the vicinity of a nuclear facility after defeating the interceptors that were launched against them. The vicinity. Dimona is in the vicinity. The IAEA said restraint in the vicinity. Iran hit the vicinity. Nobody intercepted it. Let's talk about what Israel's parliament speaker said before the Arad strike was even confirmed. Because the timing of Galabah's statement published, while the dust from the Dimona strike was still settling before the full picture of the Iraq strike had emerged, is the specific real-time Iranian reading of what the failed interception means. If the Israeli regime is unable to intercept missiles in the heavily protected Dimona area, it is operationally a sign of entering a new phase of the battle. A new phase. The Speaker of Iran's parliament announced publicly in real time while 180 people were being treated for injuries from the missiles his government fired, that the failure to intercept those missiles represents a qualitative change in the conflict. New phase does not mean more of the same. New phase means the operational character of the conflict has changed. The barrier that prevented Iranian missiles from successfully engaging the most protected Israeli airspace has been demonstrated to be penetrable. The phase that begins after that demonstration is the phase in which Iranian targeting can incorporate the penetrability of that airspace into its operational planning. The new phase that Golab announced is not a phase of Iranian rhetoric. It is a phase defined by the operational fact that interceptors launched at missiles heading for Dimona missed and 180 people are injured. And the Nuclear Research Center is 10 kilometers from where the missiles hit. And the interceptors that were supposed to make that 10 kilometers irrelevant launched and missed. Let's talk about what the Trump administration is managing tonight, from the specific convergence of the Dimona strike and the April 6th deadline that expires tomorrow. Trump launched this conflict with the stated objectives of eliminating Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities and creating the conditions for regime change. 35 days of the most intensive American air campaign since Iraq has been pursuing those objectives. The IAEA says the nuclear program still exists. The IRGC confirmed its new missiles have not been fired. And tonight, Iranian missiles defeated Israeli interceptors in the airspace above the city closest to Israel's nuclear program. The specific irony that the conflict launched to prevent nuclear risk has produced a night where Iranian missiles reach the vicinity of Israel's nuclear research center is the specific irony that the administration's critics are measuring against the April 6th deadline. Trump must decide tomorrow whether to execute the power plant strikes against the backdrop of 180 injured in Dimona, against failed interceptors at the nuclear city, against the IAEA's maximum restraint statement against Netanyahu, saying, "Look, the power plant strikes against 90 million Iranians, electricity supply are the specific escalation whose Iranian response the entire Gulf region is calculating tonight." Iran's response to power plant strikes will not be a diplomatic note, and tonight, Iran demonstrated that its response can reach the city next to Israel's nuclear reactor without being intercepted. Here is what Iran hitting the city next to Israel's nuclear reactor and injuring 180 people without a single successful interception means for this war from this morning forward. It means the interception assumption that has been the foundation of Israeli civil defense across 35 days has been tested at the location where it most absolutely could not fail and has failed. Not a coverage failure where no interceptors were available, an engagement failure where the interceptors launched and missed. The distinction matters because coverage failures are addressable by restoring the interceptor supply. Engagement failures require understanding why the missiles survive the engagement. And if the answer is Iranian missile technology advancement, then restoring interceptor supply does not address the underlying capability gap. It means 180 people injured in Dimona and Iraq are the human evidence that the nuclear research center's 10-kilometer geographic buffer between it and Iranian missile impacts has been tested. Tonight, the buffer held, not because the defense worked, because the missiles hit the city and not the center by 10 kilometers by luck. As Netanyahu said, it means the IAEA's maximum restraint statement and Russia's catastrophic disaster warning are describing a geographic reality, the 10 kilometers, whose reduction from one strike to the next is the specific escalation trajectory that the phrase "new phase of the battle" is announcing. And it means the woman who said, "We thought we were safe," was living in a city whose safety assumption died tonight. Not because Iran hit the nuclear center, because nobody intercepted the missiles that hit the city next to it. The interceptors launched. They missed. 180 people injured. Buildings collapsed. Facades sheared off. Supermarkets destroyed. A 3-story building collapsed. And the Nuclear Research Center is 10 kilometers from the craters. Intact by luck on day 35, the night before April 6th when the interceptors launched and nobody intercepted.